Meanwhile, Beauregard was negotiating with Brown. Though they came to an understanding about the disposition of the militia, Brown still tried to keep control of the state troops. When Sherman was burning Atlanta, preparatory to the march to the sea, Brown addressed to the Secretary of War another interminable epistle, denouncing the Confederate authorities and asserting his willingness to fight both the South and the North if they did not both cease invading his rights. But the people of Georgia were better balanced than their governor. Under the leadership of such men as Cobb, they rose to the occasion and did their part in what proved a vain attempt to conduct a people's war. Their delegation at Richmond sent out a stirring appeal, assuring them that Davis was doing for them all it was possible to do. "Let every man fly to arms," said the appeal. "Remove your negroes, horses, cattle, and provisions from before Sherman's army, and burn what you cannot carry. Burn all bridges, and block up the roads in his route. Assail the invader in front, flank, and rear by night and by day. Let him have no rest." The Richmond government was unable to detach any considerable force from the northern front. Its contribution to the forces in Georgia was accomplished by such pathetic means as a general order calling to the colors all soldiers furloughed or in the hospital, except those unable to travel, by revoking all exemptions to farmers, planters, and mechanics, except munitions workers, and by placing 1/5 of the Ordnance and Mining Bureau in the battle service. All the world knows how futile were these endeavors to stop the whirlwind of desolation that was Sherman's march. He spent his Christmas Day in Savannah. Then the center of gravity shifted from Georgia to South Carolina. Throughout the 2 desperate months that closed 1864, the authorities of South Carolina had vainly sought for help from Richmond. Twice the governor made official request for the return to South Carolina of some of her own troops who were at the front in Virginia. Davis first evaded and then refused the request. Lee had informed him that if the forces on the northern front were reduced, the evacuation of Richmond would become inevitable. The South Carolina government in December 1864 seemed to have concluded that the state must save itself. A state conscription act was passed placing all white males between the ages of 16 and 60 at the disposal of the state authorities for emergency duty. An exemption act set forth a long list of persons who should not be liable to conscription by the Confederate government. Still, a third act regulated the impressment of slaves for work on fortifications so as to enable the state authorities to hold a check upon the Confederate authorities. The significance of the 3 statutes was interpreted by a South Carolina soldier, General John S. Preston, in a letter to the Secretary of War that was a well of despair. This legislation is an explicit declaration that this state does not intend to contribute another soldier or slave to the public defense, except on such terms it may be dictated by her authorities. The example will speedily be followed by North Carolina and Georgia, the executives of those states having already assumed the position. The division between the two parties in South Carolina had now become bitter. To Preston, the men behind the State Exemption Act appeared as designing knaves. The Mercury, on the other hand, was never more relentless toward Davis than in the winter of 1864 and 1865. However, none or almost none of the anti-Davis men in South Carolina made the least suggestion of giving up the struggle. To fight to the end, but also to act as a check upon the central government, as the new governor, Andrew G. McGrath, said in his inaugural address in December 1864, was the aim of the dominant party in South Carolina. How far the state government and the Confederate government had drifted apart is shown by two comments which were made in January 1865. Lee complained that the South Carolina regiments, much reduced by hard service, were not being recruited up to their proper strength because of the measures adopted in the southeastern states to retain conscripts at home. About the same date, the Mercury arraigned Davis for leaving South Carolina defenseless in the face of Sherman's coming offensive and asked whether Davis intended to surrender the Confederacy. And in the midst of this critical period, the labor problem pushed to the fore again. The revocation of industrial details, necessary as it was, had put almost the whole male population, in theory, at least in the general Confederate Army. How far-reaching was the effect of this order may be judged from the experience of the Columbia and Augusta Railroad Company. This road was building through the interior of the state a new line which was rendered imperatively necessary by Sherman's seizure of the lines terminating at Savannah. The effect of the revocation order on the work in progress was described by the president of the road in a letter to the Secretary of War. In July and August, I made a fair beginning, and by October we had about 600 hands. General Order Number 77 took off many of our contractors and hands. We still had increased the number of hands to about 400 when Sherman started from Atlanta. The military authorities of Augusta took about 300 of them to fortify that city. These contractors, being from Georgia, returned with their slaves to their homes after being discharged at Augusta. We still have between 500 and 600 hands at work and are adding to the force every week. The great difficulty has been in getting contractors exempt or definitely detailed since Order Number 77. I have not exceeded 8 or 9 contractors now detailed. The rest are exempt from other causes or overage. It was against such a background of economic confusion that McGrath wrote to the governor of North Carolina making a revolutionary proposal, virtually admitting that the Confederacy had been shattered, and knowing the disposition of those in authority to see only the military aspects of any given situation, he prophesied two things: that the generals would soon attempt to withdraw Lee's army south of Virginia, and that the Virginia troops in that army would refuse to go. It is natural under the circumstances, said he, that they would not. He would prepare for this emergency by an agreement among the southeastern and Gulf states to act together irrespective of Richmond, and would thus will the military power of these states into a compact an organized mass.